All right, today we will talk about concupiscence. First, what is concupiscence? In itself, it is an appetite of the senses, a natural inclination to sensible goods. So in itself, there's nothing wrong with it. It's placed there by God even before the fall, it's a sensitive faculty, so that we are drawn to things that are good, just like eating. If eating was something very unpleasant, you would never do it, and then you would starve to death. So there's a concupiscible appetite. And the other is reproduction. If that were an unpleasant thing to do, no one would have any babies, and then the human race would die out. So that's the reason for those things. So it's perfectly normal and good in itself. But it must not be contrary to reason and the law of God. And that's where we have problems, because since the fall, it is in rebellion. You have to understand that before the fall, the concupiscible and irascible appetites, because the irascible, you should know this from philosophy, maybe you haven't taken it yet, but the irascible has as its object the difficult good. So it wants to accomplish things that are difficult. Climbing Mount Everest, for example, takes a lot of irascible appetite. See, it's a challenge. I'm going to do it, you know. Or doing anything difficult. I mean, even things that are not as dramatic as that, but anything that requires effort and something to surmount, problems to surmount. And that is there in order that you accomplish things that you need to accomplish. So it's known as the irascible appetite. So pole vaulting, for example, you look at that line that you have to get over and do it, you know. So that's the irascible appetite. So, and that's good too, except that gets out of hand. And so both of those things were completely under control, in the same way that you might turn up the volume of your audio equipment or turn it down. So those things were able to be turned on and off or regulated according to reason by Adam and Eve. That was the original idea of those things. But now they're in rebellion. So is concupiscence a sin? See, the Protestants confused concupiscence with sin. You know, that original sin is in us, and we are still in sin, and concupiscence is proof of it. It's sin in us, you see. That's wrong. It's not a sin in itself. Sin comes from the will. That's a very important point. Peccatum est in voluntate. Concupiscence, which is born and propagated by original sin in itself, is not the sin, but the penalty of the sin. And by the way, did you know, you learned this too, that original sin is transferred by the male, not by the female. Yes. And that's one of the speculations why there is a certain shame about sexual acts, that it is the place of the transfer of sin. Because why is there a certain shame about it? Why is it? There's really no reason, but there is. There's something about it that has a sense of shame, and that's the speculation. I've seen that it's the place of the transfer of original sin. So in any case, it's the penalty of the sin. So it is a continual subject of struggle. See, it provides a problem in the soul that you constantly are struggling against this tendency, this rebellious tendency of concupiscence to have its object no matter what. Reason has nothing to say to me. I want this. See, and so there's a struggle constantly against this rebellious concupiscence. That's the penalty. It's a fight, and it's a victory or a loss, but it happens every day. So it is not the sin itself unless the will is joined to it. So it wants to drag the will in. So we are delivered to concupiscence as to a tyrant. So it wants to dominate us. Nevertheless, we are not, strictly speaking, handed over to sin, since concupiscence does not constrain us to sin. Again, Martin Luther denied free will. He said that he was an ass and a donkey, all right? But, that's what he said. He was not, let's say, the most refined person when it came to language, all right? And some days the devil is riding me, and some days God is riding me, is Martin Luther. So you're not responsible for what you do. Also, that God does not expect us to obey the commandments because he knows that we can't. It's Martin Luther. So, St. Bernard said, to feel the movements of concupiscence is not a sin, but to taste them voluntarily and freely, there sin is found. So merely feeling the movements of concupiscence is not a sin. Even violent movements is not a sin. So you always have to distinguish that when you are preparing your confessions. You might feel that you've had some very strong temptations, but a temptation is a temptation, and there's no sin in a temptation. As a matter of fact, it might be a source of merit. A well-resisted temptation is very meritorious. So but you should never feel guilty because you've had, strong concupiscible temptations. So there's some scrupulous people might have a tendency to do that, or just even people not suffering from scruples. It makes you feel bad. So, but you should distinguish those things. And, as future priests, distinguish those things for penitence. See, that's important to do that. St. Paul said, "But I see another law in my members, fighting against the law of my mind and captivating me in the law of sin that is in my members." Another very famous quote of St. Paul. He is saying that he senses, quote, "a law in me," this is a paraphrase, "a law in me which holds me captive, which does not oblige my will to obey, but in moving me despite myself and despite my resistance, since it is so strong, I am forced to sense the movements which it excites down to the bottom of my heart, but I am not forced to take pleasure in them. We are therefore under the yoke of concupiscence, but not under the yoke of sin." He is obviously referring to temptations to impurity. Because, sitting in front of a cupcake will not do this to you. Right? In other words, having a concupiscible moment in front of food. Well, maybe some of you. Yes, Dorothy bought 12 pounds of beets the other day, and there was hardly anything left after you got through with them. So maybe, you have these strong desires for food, but in most cases, these strong desires refer to temptations toward impurity, which is, a constant source of temptation. It's just constant. So, and you must constantly fight against it. Concupiscence makes itself felt in us. Nevertheless, we listen to it and we don't obey it for as long as we do not consent to it. Consent is in the will. The movements of concupiscence are not sins, provided that they be involuntary. So no matter what happens, if it's involuntary, it's not a sin. St. Augustine said, "He alone is condemned who has let himself be dragged by concupiscence, by the concupiscence of the flesh." It is not in our power to avoid or drive away entirely the movements of concupiscence. What does depend on us and on our will is to consent to it. If we do that, then there is sin. St. John Chrysostom said, "To feel concupiscence pertains to nature, but to desire the evil pertains to the domain of the will." St. Gregory the Great said, "When an evil thought presents itself and solicits our consent, it does not soil our soul in any way. It only soils it when the soul submits itself to it by taking pleasure in it." So you could be tempted for hours by impure thoughts. That's usually the sign of the devil. Temptations toward impurity come either from nature or the devil. From nature, they present themselves from time to time, especially if there's some occasion. But if they are very vivid and persistent, that's a sign of the devil. Because the ones from nature you can get rid of fairly easily, saying a short prayer or something like that. But the devil, this is spiritual writers who say this, what is typically a sign of the devil is the persistence and the vividness of them, and many times the bizarre quality of them, things that you would never, ever think of on your own. That's a sign of the devil. And there you're dealing with a big enemy. The door of impurity is the weakest door in the city. And he bangs on that first to get a soul. And many times it collapses and he walks in. All right? So he's going to bang on that, especially if you are beginning in the spiritual life. Beginners tend to have more trouble with those things. So if you're beginning in the spiritual life, and particularly if you have had some habits of sin and then converted morally, let's say moral conversion, in other words, I'll put aside all of those sins and lead a good life. That's a moral conversion. And then he's really going to get one of those rams and try to push that door down, because he knows that's where you're the weakest. So, but prayer is going to overcome all of it. If you're praying, you're not consenting. That's what St. Alphonsus says. I'll get you the quote. So you can be sure that if you're praying your way through it, you're not consenting. St. Cyprian said, "When I speak of the affections of the flesh, I am speaking improperly, because these affections indeed pertain to the soul, which alone feels, moves, lives, and to which sin is imputed, because to it alone has been given free will, reason, knowledge, and power. By means of the faculties, it is able to condemn evil, refuse to commit it, excuse me, and choose the good. The soul uses the body in the same way that a blacksmith uses the anvil and the hammer in order to give to his idols all of the shameful forms that he wishes, and to fashion false gods according to his pleasure. It is not the flesh which pushes us to sin. It is not the flesh which inspires us to sin, nor which conceives of evil acts. The flesh is not able to make use of thought, but the flesh is the arsenal in which are found the instruments of the soul. It is the soul which makes the flesh do everything which it has decided to do, and consummates these acts in the flesh. That flesh is unable to sense is clear when the soul leaves the body. When you're dead, you are totally insensitive. You could light a fire under a dead body, nothing's going to happen, so that it might burn up. From this moment forward, in fact, the flesh is fit for nothing. From the point of death, it's just going to become a pile of chemicals. It is already a pile of chemicals once the soul leaves the body. That's all it is. And they are going to gradually disintegrate and turn to dust and go back to what they originally were. Dirt. Remember, man, that thou art dust, which is a nice word for dirt. And because you were created from the slime of the earth. Remember that. So all you are basically is slime of the earth, glorified slime of the earth. Remember that. It's good for humility. And unto dust thou shalt return, which is a nice word for dirt. And he says the body is nothing more than a mass of corruption after death. Remember, that's how Saint Francis Borgia was converted. He went to see it was not Isabella the Great, or Queen Isabella, wife of Ferdinand, but a Princess Isabella. And you probably know who she is, but I can't remember who she is. And she died at a young age. She was the most beautiful woman. He looked at her in the coffin and practically passed out. He was a big, fat man, St. Francis Borgia, who was a Spanish noble and lived a worldly life, and Borgia, And he was absolutely horrified at what he saw, that such a beautiful woman can turn into something so ugly as what he saw in the coffin. And that was his moment of conversion. And then he became emaciated. I mean, he did so much fasting that he was a very thin person by the time he was, he was the head of the Jesuit order, but he did tremendous penance for his previous life. That was St. Francis Borgia. So he redeemed the Borgia name. Although Alexander VI, according to a book I read by a Protestant, was maligned, that he didn't have the illegitimate children, and that he was maligned by a priest who was basically an Italian gossip monger who hated the Borgias. The Borgias were detested by the party of the Florentines, I forget their name. They were detested almost by everybody, the Della Roveres, and there was a lot of tension in Italy at the time between the big families, Della Rovere, Sforza, and Borgia, and somebody else, I can't remember their names. Medici. So the Borgias were detested, so this gossip monger priest is the only source for that. And he pointed that out. There's no one else. And that when he was a younger man and was an ambassador, I believe, to Spain, spent time in Spain, he led a very, very upstanding life. I mean, he did not have a history of running around with women or anything like that. That his life there's no evidence for it. So he was maligned, most probably. So anyway, that just something. There's a footnote on the Borgias, but the point is that you turn into a mass of corruption and you get very ugly, and then you start to stink. All right, so badly that people can't be in the same room with you. We're used to these nice death things where they put all sorts of stuff in you so that you don't smell bad and you don't rot. But if you just leave a body without any of that, it is going to smell so bad that you won't be able to stay in the same room with it. And that will happen in 48 hours maybe. The body turns black and just, it's all rotten and putrefied and stinking. All right, just to let you know that. So, make you feel good. It's like a cheerful earful. So, everything that is in man, this is still St. Cyprian, everything that is in man which comprehends and senses is by its very nature alien to the body. It's the soul that comprehends its senses. So the soul is the source of all sensitivity. See, that's why the fire of hell, and the theologians say this is a special fire, our Lord said that, to the fire prepared for the devil and those who follow him. It's a special fire that affects the very sensitivity of the soul, the very source of sensitivity. Not the body, which is sensitive, but the very heart of sensitivity, which is the soul, which is the worst possible. It'd be like hitting a nerve, when you're at the dentist and they hit a nerve. Just think of that. The nerve is the closest thing to that, but it's even worse than that. It's a cheerful earful.